Our next guest up on the stage is somebody who came all the way from Tennessee to be here today. And I've been telling you throughout the show that one of the things that we have to think about is medical freedom. And this next guest came all the way from Tennessee to not just talk about medical freedom, but to talk about our personal freedoms when it relates to the WHO, the World Economic Forum. There's a lot of things that she talks about on her podcast and program. And the reason I'm bringing her up next is she's also going to be before our medical freedom panel, which is another set of guests, which I'll talk about before they come up. It's going to be this next hour and a half is going to be something that you are thoroughly going to enjoy. And we're going to have food here in the back here in just a minute. But when Courtenay Turner is all the way from Tennessee, she has a podcast. She's an activist in her community, in our country. She travels the United States gathering information. She does something that I do. When you travel, you meet people, you learn more. You find that there's other people across the United States that's working together for the common good of our country, especially when it pertains to freedom. And I highly encourage you, after you listen to her today, to look up her podcast, look up her platform, and find out more about her, because her information will not only inform you, it will motivate you, and it will make you want to learn more, to make you hungry for the truth, and she has that. Courtenay Turner, thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Hello. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Yes, medical freedom is absolutely something that is incredibly important and personal to me. I won't take up too much of your time to hear, but you can go check out my story. I was born with a very unique set of circumstances. My mom was actually sick during first trimester of pregnancy. This rendered me with all sorts of complications, not limited to, but including, I was born blind in one eye. I wear bilateral hearing aids. I actually learned how to speak by reading lips. I didn't get hearing aids until I was almost 6 years old. I had heart surgery when I was 1 year old. I was born with fine and graphic motor impairment, hypotonic limbs. They told my mom the best she could hope was to find a nice institution for me to spend my life. And fortunately, they were wrong. But needless to say, we were, exploring all sorts of alternative, and everybody really just didn't think there was much hope for me at all. And if I were living in the world that the WHO and the UN want to see for us, I probably would not be here today. In fact, most of those people are eugenicists and, who subscribe to a Malthusian worldview. And one of the primary arguments for Planned Parenthood was that people with disabilities should not be here. So I would probably not be here at all. So that is why I am personally really passionate about the personal agency, individual agency, and free will, which is really what I'm going to talk to you about today. I started this podcast because I was living in Santa Monica, California in 2020, and as you might imagine, it's a little different than it is here in Louisiana. The measures were quite egregious and very tyrannical, and I did not realize how much I depended on nonverbal communication for clarity of speech because I wear hearing aids. So I think of myself as just a normal, able-bodied hearing person. But I actually depend tremendously on lip reading still to this day, and I didn't realize it until all the coping mechanisms I spent my life developing were then stripped from me. And so, long story not so short, but this led me to starting my podcast, mostly because I wanted to have naked-face conversations with people, be able to see their face, and I thought that this might restore my sense of purpose and just, joy for life. And so that was how this began. And I think this is really the crux of what we're up against, which is this age-old battle, and it really is a worldview clash. It's a clash between people who believe that we were endowed with inalienable rights from our Creator, and that we are not God, and that we were endowed with free will. And those that believe that they know better for everybody else, how we should live our lives, and that we don't actually have free will because we are all part of what Teilhard de Chardin would call the noosphere, and so therefore we either collectively evolve, we do a conscious evolution, or we get subsumed and recycled, and that is just the natural process. And we also might have this great technology that can help us to all share in that noosphere so that we can elevate our potential. This is the human potential movement on steroids through a transhuman vision. And that is really, I think, what we're up against. It's the battle of these two worldviews. And I will just add from my own perspective, I think there are some people who genuinely believe that is the best path for humanity. There are people who really believe that is, this enlightened future, and humanity will be better off. And then there are others who see it as a conduit for control. And of course, this is part of why they subscribe to a Malthusian worldview, because it's much easier to control few than it is to control 8 billion people, which is what they say we have. So I'm going to start by reading a quote, and it is fairly lengthy. I think most of you will be familiar with this quote, although I don't even know if they teach it anymore in school, and most of us have not heard it since probably elementary school, and it bears repeating. So here it goes. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of God's nature entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is in the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to then shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than right to themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpation, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferances of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. Why do I bring that up now? This was 1776, more than 2 centuries ago. Of course, that was the Declaration of Independence by Jefferson, July 4th, 1776. I would argue we are up against very similar times. The founders of our country declared this declaration. They fought a revolution. It was over, largely, at least of their own words, they were saying it was because they were being taxed to death. Of course, they were being taxed less than 2% back then. That sounds like a pipe dream these days. And Kamala says that if she gets into office, she's going to tax on unrealized gains, investment, 28 to upwards of 33% taxes. I certainly hope that we will see people at least, well, let's not get to where we need to revolt. let's make sure that that does not happen. But when we think about who these people were and what their principles were that led them to establish a new country and led them to not only separate by, sea, but by principles, founding principles, and say, no more. We've had enough of your usurpations and enough of your tyranny. Who were these people and what were the principles that guided them? I would argue these are people who took tremendous risk. People often think, oh, they fled, they were explorers, but they were tremendous risk takers. These were people who had everything to lose, but they felt freedom was more important, the freedom for their posterity. Some of them had their children's lives, not just their own lives threatened, but of course their own lives were in jeopardy as well. There's actually a gene, a risk-taking gene, is the RDR4 with the 7th allele. And I would argue that this, if we believe in the principles of genetics, that means the United States of America should be comprised of tremendous risk takers, people who have a higher, proclivity or propensity to have such gene. However, this has been bred out of us. This has been bred out of us through our education system, and now that has become so egregious and so aggressive. We are being bred for compliance through indoctrination. This is the adoption of what was called the World Core Curriculum by Robert Mueller. It was part of his 2000 ideas plan that became 7,000 because he fancied himself such a visionary. But he created this World Core Curriculum of education that was actually predicated on Alice Bailey. You can find a lot of this through the UN website, through the Lucius Trust website. A lot of it came out of the externalization of the hierarchy, which was written by Alice Bailey. So I will get to that in a minute. But before I do, I wanted to talk about what were some of these guiding principles. A lot of people think of the founding fathers as being coming out of the time of the Enlightenment. And while there's truth in that, people typically think of the Enlightenment, they don't know what Enlightenment they're talking about, right? They just use it as an umbrella term, the Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment actually had several varied thinkers and varied schools of thought. There's the French Enlightenment, which was mostly romantic idealists. There was the German idealists. There was the British Enlightenment. There was what I would call the counter-Enlightenment. Some of you may have heard of some of these names, like Marx and Engels and Kant. This would be, in my opinion, counter-Enlightenment. And then there was something called the School of Scottish Common Sense Realism. And this was thinkers like Thomas Reid, who refuted mostly Descartes. He really had a problem with the theory of ideas. Some of you may be familiar with cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. And this is the old Cartesian battle, the dualistic notion of are we mind or body, and he decided, all is the mind. And this is derived actually from the ancient Corpus Hermeticus. The first Hermetic principle is mentalism. And this is the idea, you may be familiar with The Secret. This became very popular in the early 2000s, and then they later did another book, and I don't remember the exact title, but it's something like Manifest All Your Dreams from Your Couch. Oprah popularized a lot of these thinkers. These are new thought leaders. And they actually have a cult, it's called the Evolutionary Leaders, and a lot of these ideas and people are driving the UN. So that is why I bring it up. So the School of Scottish Common Sense Realism was a very pragmatic philosophy. Our founding fathers very much realized they were, I would argue this is where the notion of classical liberalism was codified. And classical liberalism, contrary to a lot of the battle going on today, it's not an ideology, it's certainly not a religion. I think of it as a framework. It's a framework that allows for metaphysics that encompass biblical frameworks, most of it is actually founded, especially for our founding fathers, on Christian metaphysics, but it also recognizes that we can know certain things empirically. If something smells like a fish, it's probably not a starfruit, sorry. It's like there are just certain things, like this podium, I could, spend all day pontificating and sitting in a cafe thinking about why it's here, how it got here. But the reality is there is a podium, and it looks like wood or some sort of plywood. And we can deal with that. What do I do with that? Our founding fathers were trying to figure out how they could encompass the notion that man is flawed, man is limited. There are certain things that we can't know. We are not God. We do not become God. But there are also things that we do know. And we can use our reason in order to, and our logic and our common senses, right? The common sense, in order to form a government that helps us navigate the world rather than sitting in a cafe pontificating on the world or our place in it. And that's precisely, I think, what they did when they created the Bill of Rights, which I think is being trampled on currently. And I always use this analogy of the beekeeper. And I say that, how they say when all the bees go, that the world will cease to exist. That's how I see America. I see America as the beekeeper for the free will of humanity. And it is because nobody disputes that there are incredibly beautiful, wonderful, magnificent places and people all over the world doing incredible things. But there is no other place in the world that has a document that codifies the principles that we see, particularly in the Declaration of Independence, that we were endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights. And then they went on to create a government that is not designed to rule over the people. The government is designed to protect the people, and primarily to be limited, to protect from any infringement upon those inalienable rights. And I think that's incredibly unique, and that is really what is at stake today. So we move on to, I do want to talk a little bit about the UN and what that is and why we are in great danger. Our free will is in such great danger. You could argue that a lot of the same people were involved in things like these tyrannies that led to us having the revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution. Those are the same kinds of people who were involved in fomenting the First World War. The First World War led to the League of Nations, right? Woodrow Wilson often gets credit in part of his 14-point plan for creating the League of Nations, but the League of Nations was a concept long before Woodrow Wilson. People like Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who was very influential on Hegel, who I think is kind of a guiding figure for methodology for a lot of the left. The dialectical principles is how they achieved most of their goals. We can save that for another day, but if you're interested in learning more about that, I just did a 2-day conference. It's called the Cognitive Liberty Conference. You can find that at cognitiveliberityconference.com, and we went into great detail on the roots of the dialectic, how it gets utilized in both psychological and political warfare. And we also spent the first day focusing on education and how they use dialectical warfare for indoctrination and to create the World Core Curriculum vision of Robert Mueller, who talks about planetics as like planetary control, much like what we see with the UN vision. He was actually Secretary General of the UN for almost 40 years. And this became Common Core in the United States. Right, or Charlotte Izabit, who's a great resource on education, if any of you are curious. She called it Communist Core. I think that's accurate. They talk about putting every child into a computer and creating a world citizen workers, not thinkers, workers. So it's a great resource. If you want to go check that out, it's cognitiveliberityconference.com. The 2-day conference and the replay is up there. So they created this League of Nations to be, the idea of the first world government, and this, of course, led to what we now know as the United Nations. So they have 2 paths, the way I see it. There's what they call global governance, and their Pact for the Future that they just did. They talked about creating UN 2.0, and and that this was to strengthen global governance. They don't call it global government anymore. Somehow global governance is a better euphemism in their eyes. I guess the global government got too much pushback. Not really sure how they're all that different. But that's one path, and that's very much through policy. The other path is through creating a syncretic one world religion. And I think that this is, again, I was saying there are people who genuinely believe this. This is their faith, and they're honest about it. I think others use it as a tool because people will, sacrifice just about anything for their religious beliefs. So if they can lure people, even if it might be through deception, into their one world religion, then they can usher everybody into their one world government. So I had mentioned Alice Bailey, right? This is who our modern education system is largely predicated upon. Who is Alice Bailey? Alice Bailey was a disciple of Madame Blavatsky. Madame Blavatsky created the Theosophical Society in 1875. And not alone, there were several others. Henry Alcott was one, Quan Judge was another. And she calls it a perennial philosophy. So it's not a religion, it's a philosophy. And it's a syncretic philosophy. It incorporates, she says, all religions and all faiths from around the world, except diametrically opposed to Christianity and traditional Judaism. And if you read her writing, she's pretty explicit about it. The reason for this is because it is a Gnostic worldview. They believe that God is Satan. They do not believe God is, Jesus Christ or, the God of the Torah. They believe it's an inverted worldview. They believe that we come from, so in the Theosophical religion, they talk about how we all come from source. So this is very much where the Gaia religion comes from. This is, the climate narratives are very much derived from this Gaia religion that we worship Mother Earth. They talk about how we come from source, and the journey of the human experience is to return to source. This is not new, although 1875 is actually not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. But Madame Blavatsky, who was one of the founders, and you can read The Secret Doctrine if you can get through it. It's pretty dark. But just so you don't take my word for it, I always encourage people to go and do their own research. And she talks about how her inspiration for a lot of these, her religious beliefs come out of the ancient mysteries. The Neoplatonists in particular, I think largely just because the Neoplatonists were very much derived from the ancient mysteries. However, they wrote much more. We have much more of their writings, so we can see what they codified. And they talk about things like the battle between the one and the many. So we're seeing the theme, the individual, the collective, the one, the many. And to them, the one is superior to the many. And they talk about returning to the undifferentiated all. And this is why a lot of policies that you see coming from, and they are coming from the supranational entities. So although the Biden administration may look like they're executing these policies, I have personally been to my state legislators in Tennessee, which you would think is a very red state. It was quite the battle. So I've been several times, and primarily on two particular issues. So one issue that I was asked to come speak on was the NACs, the Natural Asset Companies. And again, this was something we're dealing with on every local level. However, this is coming from a much greater agenda that's supranational, it's beyond the borders of the United States. This is part of, so natural asset companies are with the idea that they wanted to basically commodify the air we breathe. And some of you may remember when Nestle commodified water. And this is taking that to the next level. At the time when they did that, I remember joking, like, next they're going to commodify the air we breathe, and they're going to try and sell it. And that's exactly what they're doing. They want to, they think they're going to make upwards of $5 quadrillion on this lovely little plan. I know, it's a number you just can't fathom. Who can fathom 5? You might as well just say infinity, right? But they do think they're going to get very wealthy off of this plan. And what it was the Intrinsic Exchange Group, which was partnered with the New York Stock Exchange, largely funded by the Rockefeller, although we're same people. Although there were several other groups like IBD Labs, IBD Ventures, Abadir Ventures, and some of the subgroups were people like the World Wildlife Organization, and who was the brainchild of Julian Huxley, who was one of the founders of UNESCO, and he coined the term transhumanism in 1957. But so this was to put the natural assets, so things like water, photosynthesis, up on the New York Stock Exchange, and it was to put a proposal to the SEC. It did get withdrawn. I sounded the alarm. There were a bunch of us, trying to get the awareness, because they tried to sneak it through over the holidays, the Christmas holidays. This is very reminiscent of what happened during the federal income tax, right? This was in 1913 when they snuck that through and gave it to us as a lovely Christmas present. So I'm going to fast forward because I know I am running out of a bit of time, but this has not gone away. I would look out for it. Now it's being rebranded as something called the Sustains Act, which is referencing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and this is all about commodifying the things like all the natural processes is what they call it. So through things like carbon credits, carbon sequestering, biodiversity credits, and they do include photosynthesis and pollination in this. So this is really just so incredibly scary, but it's part of what they call the 30 by 30 agenda. And the Biden administration has put nature on the balance sheet, and they've adopted what was the UN's SEA, really it's a voodoo accounting system. And I'll tell you just a quick story on that. When I was looking up what the generally accepted accounting principles are, because every time you looked it up in reference to the NAAQS, it would just say GAAP. And so what you hover over, you're looking like a Wikipedia pops up, and so GAAP the demon popped up. And I don't know that they're connected, although I don't think they really do anything by coincidence. So it's entirely possible, but I can't verify that. However, GAAP the demon is a medical demon that finds a partner for women, but it renders them infertile. And my thought was, oh my gosh, that's exactly what they're doing to the land. This is part of a degrowth agenda, and it is part of a big land grab. They renamed it, so I just thought that was funny, but not like haha funny, but they renamed it. The Biden administration, the people didn't like the 30 by 30 agenda because it is part of the Agenda 2030 to make 30% of the world's lands, resources, waters completely unusable or inhabited by humans. And so they renamed it to America the Beautiful. This is very typical of the Marxists and the Theosophists, the New Thought, I would argue Luciferian. They invert the words, right? So it's the opposite definition. This is not about America having beautiful lands and waters and resources, although I believe that that's true. This is about a land grab agenda, which is just a stepping stone to the half-Earth agenda. So this is, I apologize, I think I'm running out of time, but I want to fast forward a little bit to talk about what they just did. They did this Summit of the Future, which is comprised of 3 different documents. This is the Pact for the Future, this is the Global Digital Compact, and then a Declaration for Future Generations. This is the UN, this was last week, and a lot of people didn't even know about it. The Pact for the Future updated their charter. This is the UN 2.0 to strengthen their global governance. I would say the most horrifying part of it was about complex global shocks, which gives them emergency powers in the case of, as Guterres said, any complex global shock, which could be a pandemic, it could be a localized trauma. It really could be anything they decide it could be. So this is very, very concerning. The second part was the Global Digital Compact, and this is all about the internet. And we've recently heard Hillary Clinton saying how, if we don't control the information, the misinformation on the internet, I'm paraphrasing, but she said that we lose total control. And she's absolutely right. That's why they're so aggressively pushing for this, under the name of hate speech and misinformation, but it's really all about censorship. And the other thing they keep saying is we have to have inclusivity. So this was part of their rhetoric around the summit of the future. But I want to remind you, what did the WHO just do? They did their pandemic treaty, and they renamed it to pandemic agreement so that it wouldn't have to be ratified, right? It wouldn't have to be agreed upon. And what they kept saying was their primary justification for doing it was that all these people in these underdeveloped countries didn't have access to vaccines. Never mind the fact that most of them didn't have the adverse reactions. They actually seem to be faring better than those in the developed countries that had the vaccine. But that's not a concern. We don't want that to happen again. We want to make sure we can vaccinate everybody. And that's exactly the argument they're making about the internet. So they're now saying we have to have inclusivity and everybody has to have access to the internet. Why? Because this is part of their vision for a well-being economy, and it is part of their plans to implement their Agenda 2045, which is the AI World Society. And the AI World Society looks like something out of a terrifying dystopian science fiction novel. However, it is a very explicit plan that has been laid out. And they talk about supplanting human governments with AI governments. They talk about having digital twins. They talk about how, we'll be all put on what they call a social value reward system. They don't call it a social credit system. It sounds so much nicer, but it is the same thing. And they do say it's based on China as the model. And they also talk about things like 6G and this is, I know it sounds like crazy conspiracy theory. You can look up the University of Amherst, Massachusetts, has already revealed their documents and their research on 6G, talking about how they will use humans to harness the power. And in the AI World Society, they talk about everything being connected, all the smart city nodes will be connected, C40, 15-minute city. And they will also, 6G will connect the Internet of Nano-Bio thing. So essentially, Teilhard de Chardin's vision of the noosphere will become a reality, and you will either evolve and co-create with them, or you will be subsumed. This is not a reality I want to live in, and so, I do not think that Trump is the Messiah. I don't think our founding fathers even wanted him to be a dictator. This is why they created the 3 branches of government to have checks and balances. They ran from a dictatorship. They ran from tyranny. So he is not supposed to be the omnipotent, all-powerful. However, he is, and his track record indicates that he is a threat to the global agenda, that he's a threat to the UN in particular. There was recently, actually, Crowder from the Mug Club, he just did a video that was undercover with the UN executive talking about how they don't think they could survive another Trump administration. My suspicion is the reason they don't think they could is because the last number I could find was that the United States funds 27% of the UN. This is almost a third. I'm sure the number's higher now. This was a few years ago. So, of course, they're terrified if we defund them. They're counting on our military-industrial complex paying them and our taxpayer dollars funding them. So that's huge. My friend Alex Newman he was there in New York, which, the UN headquarters there, which the Rockefellers donated all the money to the land for the UN. And he was there doing interviews, and a bunch of them all said they're terrified of Trump, which I think is a great sign. It's a sign that we should get Trump in office. Trump also pulled money out of the WHO in 2020. I know people talk about how he redirected it to Gavi, but that was actually an agreement that was in place before he was even in office, so it's not quite true. He started to restore peace in the Middle East. He pulled us out of the Paris Accords. I could go on and on. There's lots of evidence to indicate that he wants to put America first. And I know I've gone over time, so I'm going to wrap it up with this, just to say that, you know, America first. To think of America, you know, American protectionism. If you have children, you know, and you're struggling to feed them, you wouldn't say, hey, let me invite their entire school over for dinner, and maybe I'll be able to feed my kids. You would feed your kids first. Take care of your family first. And that's what we need. We need to restore the Bill of Rights. We need to restore the founding principles of the United States. We need to restore the borders and national sovereignty. And I am so honored to be here in Louisiana, which is setting the example, because I don't believe that, I do think we should get Trump in office, and then we need to hold his feet to the fire because he's surrounded by some not so great people, I think. So we really need to hold them accountable and make sure that these things come to fruition, that we restore the United States of America and national border. But we also need to take local action, because it's we the people, consent of the governed, right? That was what was in the Declaration of Independence. And Louisiana set precedent with a bill saying the UN, the World Economic Forum, which partnered with the UN in 2019, so these various entities have no jurisdiction over the state of Louisiana, which is amazing. And I think that's how we do it. It's we the people. So thank you so much for finding me at the Courtenay Turner podcast.
Courtenay Turner, everybody. Give her a big round of applause. Courtenay, I can't thank you enough for driving all the way from Tennessee to come here. You are amazing. And ever since I met you, I wanted everybody to get a chance to meet you and get your information. You're going to be here doing some interviews too, right? So Courtney's going to be in the lobby if you guys want to be able to meet her. If you all want to, like, we're bringing the Medical Freedom panel up here in just a second. And there's food in the back if y'all want to start getting some food. You're going to really enjoy this next Medical Freedom panel. Courtney, how do people find you again?
I'm at the Courtenay Turner podcast. You can go to CourtenayTurner.com. That has all of my information, but I do spell it a little bit differently. It's spelled like Courtenay. It is pronounced Courtney, but it's COURTENAYTURNER.com.
Thank you again so much. She's going to be here hanging out. It's not over yet.